Hello, everyone. We're just sorting out some technical difficulties and then we will start as soon as we get the nod. Thank you for joining, though. It won't be too long. For those that have just joined since I last said it, just want to thank you for all coming on. We're just dealing with some technical difficulties. Once we get the slides uploaded, we will start the session. Thank you. Okay. Jay, are you okay? Are we ready? We all good now?
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect. Well, let's welcome everyone in then. So, welcome everyone. We are happy to have you all here today. We've got a great session set up for you. If we could just move on to the next slide, though, we'll just go over some of the ground housekeeping rules for the session. We would love it if you could put your cameras on, please. It just helps for the engagement, allows us to see who we're speaking to, and rather than just blank screens. If you have any questions, we do have a Q&A at the end, so please do feel free to put your question in the chat box. We will pick them up at the end, or during the Q&A session, please feel free to put your hand up. The chat box is probably going to be a good place, though, just so you know that your question hasn't been already asked. Today's session is being recorded and it will go out later today. So because of that, all microphones have been muted. Obviously, if you are asking a question later, we can try to bring you in, but the chat box will probably be best. If you are hard of hearing, you can turn on the live transcript by clicking on the three dots at the top of the screen and clicking transcription. And as always, please be respectful and professional throughout this session. Follow these housekeeping rules and we'll all have a good time. We can move over. So I'm one of your facilitators today. I'm Aaron Scott, Project Manager with North Northamptonshire Council. I also chair the North Northampton LGBT Forum, and it is my pleasure to be joined by Laura, who will introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Laura. I work for the ICB. I'm the Vaccination and System Admin Officer at the Integrated Care Board. Thanks, Aaron.
I think we can move forward. And then I'll give this one over to you, Laura, to introduce our
so I'd like to introduce Tracy Robson, who is the Deputy Chief People Officer and Culture at the University Hospitals of Northampton.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everybody. I'm really honoured to be here today to help chair today's meeting. As Laura said, I'm Deputy Chief People Officer, People and Culture here at the University Hospital of Northampton. So that's both Kettering and Northampton hospitals. I've also had the privilege of working with Diana Belfont, who's in the background there, who's really organised us all today. So thank you. Big shout out to Diana. I was the SRO for ED&I for a couple of years with Diana and did some really interesting work and, working with her on really important conversation like the one we're about to have today. So I have the absolute privilege to introduce our keynote speaker today, Jay McCallum, who is the LGBTQ and Staff Network Lead. So Jay is going to take us through the majority of today's session, and then we'll all have an opportunity to come in and ask some questions and have a conversation. So I'm going to hand to you now, Jay.
Hello. Thank you very much. I am very excited to be presenting today. When Diana first asked me to do it, I was like, "Why do you want me?" But after having a conversation, yeah, no, it seems like it's gonna, well, hopefully be fun for everybody. So, hi, I'm Jay. My preferred pronouns are they, them. I'll go into more detail about that in a little bit. But the presentation today is going to be on activism and social change. So it's sort of speaking up for yourself and the community, and how change for the better can happen when people sort of come together. Um, so what is LGBTQ plus History Month, and why does it matter? Um, so, you know, for a long time, LGBTQ people's history was hidden, and following the repeal of Section 28, the LGBTQ plus History Month foundation was sort of started. And it was basically to sort of reclaim our past, celebrate our present, and create our future. And this year's theme is activism and social change. Um, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, and then and like my history as a LGBTQ individual, and then obviously go on to talk a little bit more generally about activism and the social changes and movements which have happened and are happening. Um, so just to start off with, obviously, throughout history, people have been activists, and some of those people have been part of the LGBTQ plus community, and that's just to try and create social change. And sort of advance society. There have been lots of different methods, so I'm not going to list everything, but obviously there's sort of quite a variety of different ways that people have been activists in the past, or sort of used their platforms to create social change. And there are some ways that we can also. But yeah, so I think I'll start by just sort of talking about me, and hopefully not keep it a little bit interesting, not too boring. So just as a little heads up, there are trigger warnings, self-harm and eating disorders. So if people need to just sort of remove themselves or mute me while I'm sort of talking about that, then feel free to. Um, but yeah, so essentially, I grew up in quite a homophobic environment. And that led to a lot of internalized homophobia, transphobia, and it was mostly sort of the product of sort of my religious upbringing. So the religious folks that I was around, again, were sort of quite LGBTQ plus phobic, and my family, my parents especially, were never really ones to support the LGBTQ plus community. So unfortunately, I was one of those kids at school whispering about the lesbian who got outed, and I was the problem. And I remember quite interestingly, there was no intervention from teachers at the time. So this was the like noughties, and I think Section 28 had only just been repealed, so it was all very sort of new that we could even sort of be talking about it, and for it to be sort of part of a positive discussion. So no intervention from teachers or peers. We weren't taught about anything, and it was sort of very much othered information. And it wasn't until a very frank conversation with my friend at 15 years old that I started to change my views. I think my friend asked if I wanted to go to a Will Young concert. And I said, "Oh God, no, Will Young, isn't he gay?" And she was just like, "Well, yeah, but he does good music. Like, what does that matter?" And I sort of went, "Well, I don't know. I've just always been told that it's not very good, and you shouldn't support like artists, people like that." So that was sort of like the little turning point. Like I'd never had a frank conversation with somebody that challenged the views that I'd sort of been raised with. So after that, I started, actually looking into things, questioning sort of what I've been raised with, and started to change my views and my own sort of personal understanding, though I kept that quiet from my folks at home. And yeah, I mean, I went to the World Young concert. It's fantastic. Not that that shows much good about my music taste. That's sort of the pop side of things. But yeah. Anyway, I got a little bit older. I experimented, and sort of decided that eventually, like, I must be bi. Like, I'd been sort of having some feelings and I'd noticed some things, and after sort of looking inward and accepting that a lot of the sort of feelings of shame that I'd felt before could have been because of that internalized homophobia, I realized, okay, maybe I'm bi. And it didn't lead to too much bullying, for my sexuality or anything at school, because I'd surrounded myself with quite some wonderful folks, and I generally had quite a supportive friend group, but I did have difficulties at home. Coming out to my mum was a disaster. She made suggestions about seeing a doctor for my problems. And this was after, a couple of months prior, I'd disclosed about self-harm and my eating disorder to her, and she'd sort of brushed it off and said, you'll be okay. You just need to get on with things. It's just your GCSEs, it's just school. You're just getting stressed. Everything will be fine. And it was only when I then came out that she made the suggestion that I needed to see a doctor. So again, that was a bit of a blow. That was like the first time that I then made a sort of a blatant pushback against the homophobia. So I made a show of commenting on women's celebrities that I might fancy, or like announcing the most recent LGBT news at dinner, just to like start to challenge the comfort that my family had sort of settled into at home. So it was my first little steps into activism, I guess. So obviously, a couple years went by. I went to university, and I started playing very inclusive sport, quad ball. It was based on a popular magic sport in a children's book that I'm not going to name because of associations with a transphobe, she who must not be named. But I essentially, being in that community, I discovered more terminology that helped me identify what I might be feeling. And I came to learn about lots of different things, not just about sexuality, but about gender diversity as well. And I decided and settled on, maybe I'm pansexual. Now, the definition of bisexuality and pansexuality have since sort of merged, but at the time, bisexual was very much sort of acknowledging man and woman. Pansexual was acknowledging that there was sort of a range of gender, not just within the binary. So again, at the time, I sort of felt, okay, no, pansexual is the one for me, even though now I identify with both and either. Bisexuality has now come to mean a lot more than just the man-woman binary. But anyway, I was surrounded by queer friends and teammates, and I was with supportive people. So whenever I had questions or wanted to have debates and discussions around the political climate, and what recently had been portrayed in the media posts, LGBTQ plus phobia and what to do about it, we would all have like really interesting discussions. And over time, it progressed to feelings of confidence that I'd finally figured it out. So I got a boyfriend. I leaned very heavily into my sexuality. So I loudly proclaimed that I was bi or pan whenever I was out with him, to ensure that none of the pesky bi erasure could happen. And I was generally, living life, sort of realizing that, I finally figured it out. I finally figured out who I am. And then after university, I had thought I'd figured everything out, but I was still quite unhappy. So I was struggling a lot with depression as I sort of entered the work world. I don't think it happened that I was working on the wards and I walked to work in the dark and then was inside the hospital with no windows and then left the work in the dark and, wasn't really getting all of my vitamins and stuff. But yeah, so I tried changing my contraceptive. I sought help for my mental health. And essentially things started spiraling and I started focusing on my weight again. So I'd had the problem with my eating disorder in school, but it started to become worse. And I was starting to get a lot more isolated because I was living up in Stoke where I'd gone to university, but a lot of my university friends had either moved back home or had moved away. So I was sort of starting to become a lot more isolated. And the only sort of people that I saw was when I drove home the 2 hours back down to Northampton to either visit friends or visit family. So eventually I decided, like, I'm going to move home. So I moved back down to Northamptonshire. And in with my boyfriend at the time, I joined NHFT. And then started to really try and lean into the being the picture perfect girlfriend, and our perfect couple. And I was thinking, okay, this must be the problem. I wasn't like putting enough effort into my friendships, into my relationship. If I start to put effort in there, then I'll feel better. But I was still struggling. So then I sort of had to go again. What do I do? What other things could I be struggling with? And I started questioning other aspects of my life. So I was doing a lot of self-reflection, and I found out about the term asexuality. And I hadn't really looked into it before, but once I started to sort of learn the definition, things started to feel like it clicked into place. I'd never really um, I was never really one to make active comments about celebrities and go, oh yeah, no, I think they're really hot. Yeah, I did it at the time to push back against my family, but I hadn't actively ever thought about doing it prior to that. And again, if anybody would say at school, like, oh, they're fit, would you sleep with them? I'd never really uh I couldn't really figure out why people could immediately go, oh yeah, like of course I would, because in my mind, like that wasn't really something that I focused on when thinking about a relationship with somebody. And asexuality, even though it is a vast spectrum, some people are sex repulsed, other people are, more grey sexual, where, they will sort of have varying levels of sexuality or sexual attraction. Um, I hadn't really interacted with anybody who was asexual, and because our society is quite sexualized, again, I hadn't really had the opportunity to explore this, but I thought, okay, well, this must be it. I've always felt a little bit other, and maybe it's because I haven't been able to engage in the conversations in the way that is expected of me. Um, so then I was like, okay, this must be it. I'm happy. I know where I am. I know who I am. Like, let's crack on with life. So I started playing D&D again with local friends because they were obviously in the area now, and I had more time to invest in my hobby, which was cosplay. And this was my first dabble into like gender bending. Now, a couple of slides ago, you saw me as a kid dressed up as a cowboy and as Spider-Man. And so, I've always been somebody who likes dressing up. But I'd never actively picked a character in cosplay who was anyone other than my assigned gender at birth, because it was always a little bit of fun when I was growing up to dress up as a different gender, but cosplay was a little bit more serious, and oh no, I've got to make sure that I'm doing the sort of accepted cosplays at the time, hit the trends. And so when I first started to dabble in this sort of gender bending, I picked like a different D&D character that was a different gender than my assigned gender at birth, and I picked a character to cosplay that wasn't my assigned gender at birth, Hiccup. And I bought a binder a couple of weeks before cosplaying Hiccup, and I put it on and remember looking in the mirror and feeling a lot of feelings that I didn't think I should have. So I shoved it in a drawer and didn't look at it again for another 2 years. I didn't wear it for the cosplay. I just put on a sports bra and I just went, no, not going to think about that. Let's just have fun with the character. So that was like the first little sign to myself that no, maybe there is something that I do need to start looking at. So eventually I started to confront my internalized transphobia. And the more I've thought about how I felt growing up, getting really excited when I got to dress up as a boy, or just be a little bit more gender non-conforming, the more it started to make sense. And unfortunately, my boyfriend at the time and my friendship group weren't particularly accepting of my exploration, I guess. So I asked people if they could use they them pronouns for me. And it was met with, of course, yes, no, of course we can do that. Of course we can support you in that. But then in practice, like time and time again, there was always sort of some excuse as to why they couldn't. And my boyfriend at the time definitely took it very hard. He wanted a girlfriend, and he found it very difficult to think of me as anything other. So we parted ways, and I eventually sort of drifted apart from my old friendship group. And I just took a couple of years to figure out who I was this time around. And this was just before and then during lockdown. So in lockdown, I forged new friendships online and sort of strengthened a community, like digitally, and surrounding myself with LGBTQ plus folks online encouraged me to be a little bit more confident and active in my work life. So in very late 2019, early 2020, I joined the staff network and then eventually became a chair. But yeah, like I think once I started expressing a little bit more gender diversity, I did start to encounter a few more uh, uh, phobias and homophobic encounter things than I had before. So I was kicked out of a Weatherspoons for being in the wrong bathroom. I had a hand injury at the time actually, so I couldn't. Somebody spilled a drink on me, and I couldn't tend to it myself. And I said to my mate, who was, is this male? I was just like, look, I don't mind going into the men's bathroom. I can go into either. So, I'm comfy just going in and you can help me out. So he was helping me like dry off my clothes. I was standing there, one hand bandaged in the air, and got a couple of side eyes as men walked in and out of the bathroom, but it wasn't anything that I thought was particularly difficult to deal with. But when we came out, there was a bouncer there, and he said, "We've had complaints about you being in that bathroom. I've just seen you come out there, so you have been in there." And I was like, "Oh yeah, well, sorry, I'm non-binary, but I also can't do anything, and my mate wouldn't have been able to go into the women's. That wouldn't have been okay." But they were just like, "Right, well, you've got to leave." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Can I finish my drink?" "No." "Okay." So we had to quickly nip past the table as we were escorted out, and basically say to our friends that we've got to go because I'm not allowed in there anymore. Um, so yeah, that was a little bit uncomfortable. And then, later on, like maybe a year later or a couple of years later, I had a partner who was, queer presenting, and we were in a queer presenting relationship. And we went on holiday and we had slurs shouted at us in the street, and sort of people's heads were turning. And this was in America, in quite a liberal, it was in San Francisco. So, we thought that it would be fairly safe there. But it wasn't. And oh goodness, sorry, automatic light. And yeah, we had heads turning and whispers and like people pointing and looking uncomfortable, both in the UK and abroad. So again, that was my sort of first big experience of LGBTQ plus phobia, because before I hadn't really been very conscious of it. I'm quite oblivious in public. I just sort of am me, and then later on I'll have people say, you know, people were like looking or whatever, and I'm like, whatever. But no, that was the first time I'd really like noticed stuff. And again, I think it was because I was more gender non-conforming, and that is, again, it's sort of a step above. You know, you've got the homophobia, but then the transphobia is just one step more, unfortunately. But yeah, so essentially, after an official diagnosis of gender dysphoria from two licensed professionals, because when you're non-binary, you have to get two diagnoses in order to have any sort of medical intervention. And I got some money which I inherited from a family friend who passed away, which my dad wanted me to keep for a house deposit. But I said, no, this is more important. And I finally had my gender affirming top surgery in 2023. So I now identify as queer, which is sort of reclaiming the slur that was used in the 80s, because I have so many labels which can apply to me, and all are relevant, but they're just different parts which make up the whole of me. So, you know, I mean, as a note, my first London Pride, I've put in the little bottom corner here. My first London Pride that I attended, there was a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist protest, and they jumped to the front of the Pride parade, and they were leading the Pride that year. And I remember, like, this was when I was actively starting to question my gender, and it was really jarring to see that somebody was protesting my existence, or my potential existence, from members who were from within the LGBTQ plus community themselves. And the reason I say that is because now I wear my scars at Pride proudly. I make sure that at Pride events, I have them on show to ensure that like folks know that I'm a safe space for trans folks, because despite my gender expression, which can be very very femme and doesn't always align with what non-binary should be, I want to make sure that sort of people know that they can come to me if they have if they're experiencing any sort of transphobia, especially in today's climate. I have two loving partners because I'm polyamorous, which is another point of tension within the religious family dynamics that I don't need to go into. And I basically try to continue to advocate for others whenever I can. So, in my personal life, I raise and support petitions and contact local government officials if I notice that there's something concerning that's going on. I know that there was I think a Conservative councillor in 2023 who declared that Pride was a sin, and that claimed that gay people should repent, I think on Twitter. And again, it's one of these things where, as soon as I saw that news, it was immediately, okay, how can we action this? How can we make sure that this person isn't allowed to represent Wellingborough, where I live? And another like Peter Bone, very homophobic and transphobic throughout his career, and with all the sexual allegations. And again, whenever things like this have come up within government, there are things like signing petitions and writing into MPs and other local councillors that can be done as little forms of activism to protest what's going on currently. Otherwise, I attend prides, I live openly when it's safe to do so, and I educate others. So that's including my family. So despite them being sort of opposed to me and some of part of either my life choices or who I am, I do still try to sort of drop in those little bits of information so that they can at least be exposed to it. I think a little bit of exposure therapy, and hopefully that will bring them around in time. It took my mum 9 years to get over the fact that I'd come out to her as bi. So, you know, I've got a few more years before she's maybe fully on board with the gender stuff. And then maybe another 10 years before she's okay with the polyamory. But again, you know, we try, we keep going. But yeah, and then, you know, at work, I've led Pride Month events and History Month events for the past 5 years. As an organisation, we've implemented new policies supporting trans staff, which I then used after my surgery, which was quite helpful. We've tried to ensure that like gender inclusive language is used when policies are reviewed, and then made changes to systems like System 1, so that many more sexualities and genders are options and listed on System 1. But yeah, otherwise, you know, we hold regular wellbeing support meetings with members, and we just try to make sure that the network presence is known around trust sites. Again, it's those little bits of activism. So I'm known for going in and like putting up little posters around the place, and the receptionists and comms know me well and think I'm a little gay menace. I joke. But yeah, you know, it's those little acts of activism. So you know, it's education. Like I do reverse mentoring with senior members of staff. I'm basically just trying to advocate for staff and service users. So yeah, I'm going to try and continue to sit in on policy changes and, you know, have changes made to trust sites, and currently trying to get gender neutral bathrooms to trust sites. So fingers crossed that project starts to go well. But yeah, like that's me, and that's my journey. Every LGBTQ plus person is different and will have different stories to tell. So, you know, I'm quite privileged that I've not had many bad experiences, but that isn't the case for all. So, you know, I'm confident enough to talk about, you know, LGBTQ plus stuff and educate folks, because I don't have the trauma and the negativity surrounding my identity, or not as much as others. And you know, other folks aren't as lucky, so they won't feel able to take on the responsibility to do that education, and you know, that's okay too. You know, if somebody says something you don't know and they're not comfortable with sharing or explaining, you can always look it up yourself. You know, otherwise, if you're with somebody like me who's willing to explain, then you know, do just ask, because you know, at the end of the day, you know, we're all living our own lives and just trying to go through things. So that's my personal journey. I'm now going to touch on a little bit in terms of sort of the diversity within LGBTQ plus, because I've talked a lot about sort of my personal language and terminology and why I use. But it can be useful just to know a little bit about what other people might experience. Um, so language helps us relate to the people around us, and helps us to find community. So if I hadn't found the language that helped me identify who I was, it might have taken me years more to figure out my own identities. So there's a ton of terminology and language to learn, or even just to dabble in. And if anyone has come across anything they don't understand recently, please feel free to write down those terms and pop them in the chat. And then obviously I can help with defining those in the Q&A, or at least guide you to where you can access the definition yourself. Especially because I have thrown a lot of terms around already, and I'm probably going to go throw around some more. But yeah, just as a breakdown, again, most people will know here, but we've got LGBTQ and then the plus. So as you can see on the screen, we've got lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and then queer or questioning. The lesbian is before the gay because of the AIDS crisis. The lesbians helped out all the gay men who weren't being touched or, you know, aided because of the stigma around AIDS. So when the term was coined, it was actually the gay men who sort of went, no, the lesbians should go first because they helped us out through this crisis, which I think is a really interesting bit of history. Anyway, and then all of the other identities are encompassed in the plus, because after a while everyone went, oh goodness, there's, you know, LGBTQIA, da 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 da. We can encompass this in a plus because there are so many identities, and it would be silly to try and fit everybody into one acronym. We'd be going forever. I even shorten this to LGBTQ, as you might have heard earlier, because again, like, it can be a little bit of a mouthful sometimes. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about sort of the diversity and why the LGBTQ plus folks being in the workplace, and that sort of impact on organizations and individuals. So obviously there are lots of different sexualities and genders, which are sort of two separate entities as a whole. And if folks are made to feel welcome and made to feel safe, then they will feel valued and more likely to be engaged and productive and loyal to the job. And it can lead to a lot higher job satisfaction and lower mental and physical health issues. If there's diversity and representation, then like an inclusive workplace attracts like a diverse pool of talent, and that can lead to increased creativity and innovation. You know, if you've got other opinions and ideas, then it can be really helpful to generate communication, and, you know, encouraging that open communication among employees and peers can be really wonderful to actually get some new opinions and you know, create new ideas. Then, you know, there's reputation as well within organizations. You know, if you've got an inclusive workspace, then it you know, improves the company's reputation, and you know, it leads to increased customer trust and loyalty. And again, you have people talking about, oh, I work at such an inclusive organization, you should come and work here too, because they actually care about me and they care about my well-being. And of course, you know, if you've got somebody who's happy with their job and happy with their work environment, then you're going to have better employee retention as well. But yeah, generally, like, LGBTQ plus inclusion provides role models for everybody that empowers employees to be their best and perform at their best potential. And obviously you've got the sort of legal and ethical responsibilities as well around, you know, making sure that companies comply with sort of anti-discrimination laws and stuff. But essentially, if you don't put these measures in place and make sure that your workplace or your general environment is LGBTQ plus friendly, then people can sort of experience higher levels of discrimination. So, you know, LGBTQ plus people experience microaggressions at different rates, depending on their gender identity and sexual orientation. So, for example, LGBTQ plus women are more likely to report experiencing microaggressions than gay men. And so, you know, if you experience microaggressions in the workplace or generally out and about, you can initially ask, if it's safe to do so, ask questions to get on the same page about the situation. And you can push back against things directly if people are making you uncomfortable. So, for example, examples of microaggressions are being the target of jokes, being pressured to play along with sexual discussion. Now, like I said earlier, our society is sort of highly sexualized anyway, but the LGBTQ plus community has been so overly sexualized and overtly sexualized and used it as a detriment. So again, LGBTQ plus folks have been very sort of strongly discriminated against and called things like pedophiles and perverts, and it's just because people don't accept or don't understand LGBTQ plus love, and don't want to acknowledge that sort of LGBTQ plus folks are just the same as them, that they try to, again, other. So it's that overt and over sexualization. So that can often be sort of like, you know, again, being asked to share their sexual history or coming out story, even if somebody's uncomfortable with doing so or hasn't overtly said, oh, I'd like to talk to you about this or say this. A lot of trans folks are asked, what's in your pants? And again, it's not anyone's business. And if we asked anybody, any cis person that, it would be seen as massively inappropriate. But it's sort of been recontextualized, and people just think that that's a normal thing to ask folks, which it isn't. Again, more microaggressions, being interrupted or talked over, being misgendered, is a massive one. All of these can be sort of those examples of microaggressions, and the impact of those are, massively lowering mood, like causing really bad mental health issues, anxiety, experiencing barriers to career progression and feeling less productive at work, and then considering leaving the job. And again, at home, you've got those strained family relationships or relationships with friends, again, if you aren't accepted. So, being able to push back against the microaggressions is really important. But if you don't feel safe, then you've got to make sure that you're creating an environment at work that does lead people to feel safe and feel confident enough to sort of rally together and rally against people who might be causing these microaggressions. So what can organizations do to ensure they create a sort of LGBTQ plus equal equality environment? So creating inclusive policies, so reviewing and updating policies, like I do, to ensure that they support LGBTQ plus people, using inclusive language. So using gender neutral language in communications, forms, handbooks, things like that. Any comms, it doesn't have to be gendered all of the time. And using the singular they them is quite natural. We do it all the time. If you find somebody's dropped their wallet on the street, then you say, oh, somebody's dropped their wallet, or somebody's dropped their hat. You don't say, so somebody, he her has dropped his or her hat. Like it's really clunky, but people are again pushing back against the use of the singular they. So gender neutral language, really easy. Providing training, so offering diversity, equality, inclusion training to staff, and promoting inclusion, so encouraging employees to be allies and celebrate openly. And of course, like creating that safe space and leading by examples. So executives can demonstrate support for LGBTQ plus issues, and doing things like making changes to the recruitment processes and the applications for non-conforming genders and titles, things like that. Again, it's just little things that can help make organizations a little bit more LGBTQ plus friendly. It's actually just encouraging folks to be open and accepting, and encouraging folks to share their stories. So where are we now? It should be a time to celebrate. It's LGBTQ plus History Month, and we're talking about all of these sort of great things that we can do and are doing. But LGBTQ plus rights are under attack. So from the US government, they're cutting sort of aid to global technology foreign aid, and then there's also sort of global technology companies allowing anti-LGBTQ plus content. We're seeing like this really disturbing rollback of rights and funding that has been put in place to protect people. In the US, those funding cuts threaten rights and safety worldwide. So, one of the US's president's first actions was to sign an executive order aimed at erasing trans, non-binary, and intersex identities. And it's not just cuts to funding that impact our rights and safety. So there are new policies allowing social media users to refer to being LGBTQ as a mental illness, as well as just promoting the promotion of dangerous things like conversion practices. So, there are lots of things going on at the moment. And, in the UK, we've had some sort of massive setbacks recently. So over the past decade, the UK has become sort of an increasingly hostile place for trans people, especially trans youth. And in addition to vilification by the mainstream media and attempts by politicians to curb the rights of trans people and curb gender affirming healthcare for trans youth, it's been severely restricted. So, in the context of this, NHS England commissioned an independent review into gender affirming healthcare and services for trans youth. And it was led by Dr. Hilary Cass. And on the 10th of April, 2024, so last year, the Cass review was published. Basically, many of its claims are inaccurate, empirically unsupported, ethically unacceptable, and they're basically just grounded in cis heteronormative prejudice. It's mostly talking about puberty blockers, and they have been used for such a long time to treat a wide variety of conditions. So, for example, hormone blockers help to fight prostate cancer, and prostate cancer basically feeds off testosterone. Another like people with endometriosis that are also given puberty blockers, they get the blockers to stop the hormone cycles that cause endometriosis to flare up. And children with precocious puberty are prescribed puberty blockers to stop them from going through puberty too early. So, with puberty blockers, transgender kids can go through the correct gender-aligned puberty alongside their peers. And the secondary sex characteristics that develop can be of the transgender adolescent's sort of preferred gender identity. What isn't reversible is the lifelong effects that going through, the wrong puberty can cause. So, like, people with prostate cancer should stay on the medication for life. People with endometriosis can stop to see how and if their symptoms redevelop, and if they do, then they can start them again. And transgender kids can stop the puberty blockers and allow their natural puberty to resume if they want. And if that is what they want, then they can. So yes, puberty blockers are reversible. But when we ask, are puberty blockers reversible, we also forget that what's not reversible. And what's not reversible is their transgender identity. So whether that's masculine, feminine, somewhere in between, neither, they're basically lifesavers. So they give trans kids the chance to have an identity that's not dominated by being trans. They can focus on school, education, music, romance, rather than unwanted and irreversible developments to their bodies and lives. So again, this is just a little snippet. I'll spare reading out all of the statistics, but this is from the Trevor Project, and they have looked into the mental health of young people in the past year. And the thing is, LGBTQ plus young people are not inherently prone to higher suicide risk because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. They're at higher risk because of how they're mistreated and stigmatized in society. And this can have like lifelong effects. Like I said, I've had quite a positive experience in my life. I haven't experienced a huge amount of homophobia or transphobia growing up. And that's because I was part of the problem, admittedly, up to the age of 15. But people do experience trauma and they hold on to that throughout their lives. And it can mean that there are people who are less able or less willing to talk about things like I am because of the trauma that they hold. And it's all because of how folks in our community are mistreated and stigmatized. I know I've talked about a lot of heavy things, so I'm really sorry. I have included a little slide here, and obviously people who have attended will get the slide deck. So you'll be able to sort of see the information in a little bit more detail. But essentially, here's a little bit in terms of sort of support groups and places that you can contact if any of this has caused any sort of feelings that you feel you need help for, essentially. And I'm sorry about that. Anyway, what can we do? So let's talk about the positives. So this is the time for our community and our allies to stand together, because history shows that we're the strongest and most effective when we work together to make change. Since 1969 and the Stonewall riots, larger protests have been happening to fight for our rights, to live peacefully and be respected as human beings. So now is the time to stand firm against the erosion of our rights and to try to ensure that progress continues to move forwards. Little small acts of daily activism that we can do. Essentially, educate yourselves and others on important issues through conversation. Have those little chats. If somebody is struggling to understand a bit of terminology, then either direct them to where they can find that information or give it yourself if you are happy with that. Support local LGBTQ plus businesses. And this ties in with using your purchasing power responsibly. If you know that there are businesses that are actively anti-LGBTQ plus, then consider, if you have the means, other options. I know that we're in a bit of a cosy lives at the moment, so things being a bit spenny might be something that means that you can't change where you're shopping and how you're shopping. But if you have the ability to, then it's those little small acts that can make a difference. Contacting elected officials about your concerns. I touched on this before, but it's something simple as either signing those petitions or writing a letter to your local MP, that can just make, if loads of people do it, then it all stacks up, and the acts of many will make a difference. So think of yourself as one of many, rather than focusing on, oh, I'm just me, I can't do anything. If we band together, then we have so much power. Sharing information on social media, again, if you can, if you use social media, then stopping misinformation by sharing actual information, or making it clear that fake news or fake information isn't correct, can be really helpful. And then volunteering your time, and sort of seeking out those opportunities to support LGBTQ plus folks in the community, or wider, on social media or online platforms, if you're able to. But yeah, essentially, it is more than a movement. We are people. We exist. We deserve the same human rights as the rest of society. And the fight that we are fighting is just the right to live peaceful lives and nothing more. Like, pride is a protest. But we're only protesting that we don't get to be safe and exist in the same space with the same privileges as other folks. So yes, I've got a little slide on how to get involved if you are part of NHFT. Otherwise, I know that we are now going to be able to move on to a Q&A, and I'm really sorry, but I know that I have run over just a little bit, so I apologize about that. I don't know who's going to jump in now, to be honest. Is it
Jay, I'll do
Tracy?
it. I think Aaron
Okay,
has
lovely.
gone. There are quite a few questions, if you don't mind. So we'll start from the beginning. How do you feel when people keep misgendering you?
I really struggle with the misgendering more lately. When I first came out, I wasn't that bothered. It was more of a, oh, I'll be she, they, I'm just dabbling. But I struggle when people consistently do it. So if I've just met somebody and I introduce myself and they go, oh, I've never really heard of that, I do a little bit of an explanation and I just say, if you can try, perfect. And if somebody slips up one time, 5 times, whatever, as long as they sort of acknowledge that they're, this is new to them, and that they're trying, or oh, sorry, like I mean I'm like, okay, yeah, cool, perfect. But it's when, I guess, if I know somebody a little bit more personally and it's happening consistently, and they're not acknowledging that they've misgendered me or anything like that, then it can be a little bit, I don't know, I just get a little bit tight in my chest, because it feels like I'm not being respected. as a person. A bit like if somebody was to get your name wrong consistently over and over and over again. It's that same thing. You know, if you correct a couple of times, after a while, you just sort of go, I don't know why I'm correcting. You know, you've obviously decided that that's my name, and you obviously don't respect me enough to remember, you know, how I like to be called. So it's similar to that, you know, like I don't mind, or you know, it doesn't bother me at the beginning. But if it's a consistent thing and people aren't acknowledging that it's something that could potentially be hurtful, then that's when I start to feel a little bit meh about it.
Okay, I should have said thank you very much for your slides. I mean, I was moved by
That's
them.
all right.
So thank you. Next one. Why are people in the workplace reluctant to declare the sexual orientation on staff records?
So I actually think that that's more from I guess I think it's more from a uh what people feel comfortable with acknowledging with the rest of their peers. And if it's not made very clear that their work colleagues are super duper accepting, or if it's not been discussed openly in the workplace, then it can be very difficult for people to sort of think about declaring that sort of thing because of the stigma that's still sort of held on. I mean, I know that whenever we sort of put new things out, or, you know, for example, in recruitment, we put a little statement next to, you know, this is why we're asking for this gender diversity or inclusive information. It's, you know, it's so that we can sort of make sure that we are being as inclusive as an organization as possible. But, you know, people don't feel confident in outing themselves until they've acknowledged or understand what sort of environment they're going to be working in. And again, if that's not made sort of very open, or isn't very clear, you know, people might be more reluctant to come out unless it's to those colleagues or, you know, peers that they have made a friendship with and feel a little bit more comfortable with, rather than it being sort of an HR thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like declaring a disability, kind of, isn't it? Some people
Exactly,
declare it, some
yeah.
people don't want to. So the next one is being LGBTQ plus career limiting.
Um, I don't know. I think I'd say that me personally, I haven't found that it's limited my career progression. But I also haven't been outwardly trans for a huge amount of time. You know, I'm already, I think I was already in my sixth role when I came out, and I haven't tried to progress further because I don't want to. So personally, I haven't found that there has been any restriction because I generally haven't wanted to progress, or haven't found that there's any restriction to my progression when I was just openly queer, in general. But I mean, I think it depends on the organization. I think it always depends on sort of the work environment that you're in, and if you know, are in an organization where they're sort of actively homophobic or transphobic folks in managerial positions, then, you know, it could limit where you could go in that company. And again, there are lots of organizations who are actively, you know, giving funds to anti-LGBTQ plus charities and things like that. So again, if this is what I was saying about sort of shopping consciously, or, you know, using your uh, uh, purchasing power responsibly. You know, if you're aware of those organizations that are being actively either anti trans or anti-LGBT, then trying to avoid them is another power that you can have, because they then have less money to give to these anti-LGBTQ plus charities. But yeah, I think it all depends on the environment and the organization that you're working in.
Thanks for that. What is the origin of Section 28 and how does it affect the LGBTQ plus community?
Okay, so I am pretty sure that I've got this right, but if I haven't, please somebody interject. I'm believe that it was brought into place in the UK during I think Thatcher, and it essentially restricted the education or discussion, and essentially kind of made it illegal to talk about being LGBTQ plus and sort of be gay. At the time it was mainly focusing on gay, but basically being part of the community, and therefore, you know, any sort of mention of it in schools, or sorry, any mention of being LGBTQ plus in schools was sort of completely eradicated. It wasn't discussed on TV, films, sort of any media that was put out by the UK. And it was only when it was repealed in 2000 and God, I think it was 2003, maybe 2005. That was an odd number. But the early noughties, that those things were then allowed to be actively present in media and in school curriculums and stuff. But again, you know, I was in school in the noughties, and because it had only just been repealed, you know, it took at least 10 years for things like that to even be discussed, because again, people were so scared that, you know, their teaching licenses and, you know, other things were going to be taken away because they were talking about this, even though, you know, the section was repealed. But yeah, essentially it just had a massive impact on the community by censoring our existence, and it made it very easy to be homophobic and LGBTQ plus phobic, because of the fact that you couldn't really post or, you know, talk about anything positive about the LGBTQ plus community, at least officially. So yeah, basically it was just massively censoring, and it was only in the early noughties that the censoring was repealed, and it was okay to talk about again. But if you've got this long-standing fear of talking about it in general, then yeah, again, you know, it's going to take years to get over that fear, to even feel comfortable discussing things. I hope that makes sense. I'm not very articulate when I've not got a little thing.
That's okay. I think this one you may have answered, but I'll ask it again anyway. Can you think of a time when you've experienced discrimination because you view yourself as queer?
Yeah, I mean, um, so obviously, you know, again, I'm sorry, I'm in a cupboard. I just need to move. And there we go. The light's back on. Uh, I think, you know, I did touch a little bit on sort of what I've experienced, but I think I said, like, I'm not hugely aware of things because I haven't developed that hyper awareness. Again, I've grown up quite privileged. I'm a privileged queer, in that I didn't experience sort of or notice a huge amount of discrimination growing up and when I was coming out, because I surrounded myself with those really accepting peer groups. And therefore, I am incredibly oblivious to the things that do go on around me. But I have noticed, or I've been told, for example, like when I've been out with either of my partners, they've said, "Oh, you know, did you see that person? They were looking at us funny," or, "Oh, you know, did you hear that person heckling us from across the street?" And I'd be like, "Oh, no, I didn't, but are you okay?" Because, you know, I am generally blissfully unaware of the things that other people do, because I just like focus on me. But I know that not everybody can do that. I mean, I know recently I went to a charity shop, and the person behind the counter was so lovely to everybody else. Um, and then me and my girlfriend got to the counter, and she was so standoffish and rude. And, you know, we said, "Oh, can we have a bag for these skirts?" And she was just like, "Oh, I don't give bags," you know, even though we'd seen her give out bags to the folks in the queue before us. And, you know, we left and we were like, do you think that was because have been presenting as a queer couple, or was it just because we were loud in the shop and trying on hats? Like, what do you think? And we were sort of like hypothesizing what it could have been. You know, was she really homophobic, or was she just grumpy that we'd been trying on things in the charity shop? And, you know, you never know. But again, it's those little microaggressions, and it just puts those little seeds of doubt, like, oh, like, was it me as a person, or was it me because I was acting a little bit inappropriate in a shop? You know, so yeah, like there are little instances, But again, like I've said, I'm reasonably lucky that I don't pay attention to other people and what they think of me, so I'm less inclined to notice when people are being mean.
Think I need to take a leaf out of your book. So this next question might be a bit of a double act between yourself, Jay, and Tracy.
Mhm.
What advice would you give to organisations who would like to become LGBTQ plus inclusive?
I'm very happy for Tracy to take that.
Why, thank you. Well, for me, it is educate yourselves, be interested, be curious. I think having a network really helps, and get some people involved to help you understand, learn. Because for all the reasons that Jay has talked to, you know, we live in a diverse world. It's very important, I think, for a lot of companies to grow and develop an inclusive culture, which means you need people to help you do that. And don't think that you do need leaders at the top, of course, to really be open to it. And if you've got them, then it's encouraging them to grow their kind of competence. Be curious, but definitely partnering with people like Jay. Having a network really helps. And then you start to build that into, when you really mean it, you're building it into your policies, the way you do things. You accept that you're on a continuous learning journey. I think it's okay not to know everything, not to really, exactly what Jay was talking about, on an individual basis, leaders I encourage to grow their competence, whether that's through reading or being reverse mentored. That's really helpful. But when an organisation is really serious about it, it runs through the fabric. And I think we're if I take UHN, we're about to start a belonging strategy, and we called it that very specifically because we want to create as broad an environment as we can. That's certainly my perspective on when organisations really mean it.
Don't know if I've lost Jay, so I'll go
No,
to the
yeah.
next. Oh, you're still there. It's right, you're frozen
Yeah.
on my screen.
Oh
There
no.
was just a couple of comments from Jonathan in the chat. So another question. Is my child trans or just confused? How can I tell if my child is really trans?
Okay, that's a really interesting one. So I think I touched on it very briefly. But when I was younger, I really enjoyed being very gender non-conforming. So I liked being one of the boys. And I remember, I think I was about 7 years old, and we went to this is relevant, I promise. We went to Legoland, and at the end of the day, there was like the water fountains. It was summer, so the water fountains were on, and you could. It was like this area where you could like run in between the water and jump. I think I can't exactly remember, but I know that there was water shooting out of the ground and lots of kids having fun. Um, and the family friends that we went with, they had two sons around mine and my brother's age, and all of the boys got stripped down to their pants and ushered off into the water, and I started to do the same. But I was told that I had to keep my t-shirt on, and I was 7, and I didn't really understand why. And I was just being told by the adults, "Oh, you just need to keep your t-shirt on." And I was like, "No, but it's going to get wet, and then I'm not going to have a t-shirt, and my jumper's scratchy, and I don't want my jumper on." And Greg and Harry and they've all been able to take their t-shirts off. Why can't I have mine off? Um, and I remember just being told, "Well, no, you just have to because you're a girl." And I thought that it was absolutely ridiculous because I didn't think that I didn't feel any different to the others, to the boys. I just wanted to go and play in the water. And at the time, that memory was just a memory. But after, like, I would always come back to it in my therapy sessions, and especially when I had the gender dysphoria sort of sessions and the therapy around that. Although I'd touched on it in sort of my mental health therapy sessions prior, and I was like, this feels like a core memory, but I'm not too sure why. So when I had my gender dysphoria sessions, they said, well, it sounds like you were not feeling like you were necessarily identifying as a girl, and you weren't being given the opportunity to sort of explore that, or sort of just to that they weren't acknowledging that you weren't sort of conforming to the expectations. I ruined so many skirts and dresses because my mum would insist on me only wearing skirts and dresses and pretty little bows, and I would eventually insisted on having trousers, which she did give me, but they had to be pink or white and have butterflies on. So like I had my like compromises. I was allowed trousers, but they had to be feminine. And I remember always thinking like, this is going to get ruined because I'm going up the trees. I'm playing football with the boys. And again, like thinking back on these experiences, it wasn't that I wanted to be a boy or wanted to be different. I just wanted to express myself in the way that I felt inside, but I didn't have the language to explain how I felt, or what I was feeling at the time. And this is why I'm so such an advocate for educating even young, like even educating youth. I know that lots of people say like, oh, we have to decide about when we introduce LGBTQ plus themes to kids, but I always think that if you introduce language neutrally, then kids can decide what they think about it. You don't have to be going, this is really good, you need to be gay, because that's not what we're doing when we're saying we want to educate young people. What we're saying is we want to educate them so that they have the language, so that if they start having these feelings that I had, that they can be taken seriously and they can be allowed to explore. So to answer your question, it's not necessarily whether they might not know what they are, and you obviously don't know what they are, but you can go along with what they are telling you because they are the best person to know themselves. And if you give them the opportunity to explore who they are, then yes, they might, dabble in binary trans. They might decide, okay, yeah, no, that is for me. I am trans. This is my identity. But they also might think, after maybe a year or two of sort of living as a different gender, okay, no, this isn't quite for me. I think I might be gender non-conforming, or no, actually, no, I do think that I am female or male binary, and it's just giving kids an opportunity to like explore who they are and be themselves, and give them that safe environment that makes it as safe as possible. Because as I touched on, things like the like puberty blockers are reversible, but any other sort of medical transition on top of that is only after sort of rigorous uh like either, well, a mixture of therapy and discussion with health professionals, and sort of assessments and lived experience for an amount of time. And people again are talking about how um kids shouldn't be allowed to be trans because of the fact that they'll make changes to their bodies. And nobody's doing radical surgery on kids. Again, it's all of this stuff that's sort of put in the media to scare us, when actually trans kids are just being allowed to live as themselves for a little while, to see how they feel. And if they do feel like they are trans, and they identify that within themselves, and they go, actually no, I am trans, then they're allowed to start down the process of exploring that, and actually acting on that. And I think that folks should be given the opportunity to at least explore the who they are, so that down the line they have the ability to step into more permanent changes if they want to, when they're older and have sort of done lots of self-reflection, and can actually sort of act on it with confidence. I took quite a few years to figure out who I was, and I had lots of therapy because I wanted to know that I was definitely feeling the way that I was feeling. And I did that for myself. And my mum actually paid for a bit of my therapy because she thought that it was going to just turn me cis again. Whereas actually, all it was me sort of being confident, so that, if down the line I started to think, oh, do I regret this? I could call back to the discussions about that summer evening in Legoland and go, no, actually, no, I was feeling those feelings about my chest then, and why should I cover this up? Because it's just the same as everybody else's. So yeah, it was quite a long, semi-personal rant, I'm afraid. But hopefully that sort of gives a little bit of clarity around, just accepting what trans youth are saying and allowing them to be themselves, just so that you can explore with them what they're feeling and how they're feeling it.
I've got there's comments in the chat just saying thank you for your presentation and well done and things. So the very last question that I can see here, why have IT not changed your online handle?
Okay. You know what? Mainly because I haven't asked them to. I know that well, one, if I changed my name on the system, then my email address would be changed. And I've given my email address to so many people professionally. And I don't want the hassle of going through all of that. But on top of that, as a non-binary person, I use the nickname Jay because it helps to stop people from presuming my gender straight off the bat. So it's almost like a little uh initial barrier for me. So if somebody sees that my name is Jennifer, then they will sometimes just immediately go to Jenny, and I'm like, huh? So because I've had experiences where people have sort of seen my name and gone, oh, a woman. And that's made me uncomfortable because then I have to sort of backtrack in their mind, and they have to do the backtrack themselves. I found it that using a nickname for myself, I call it a nickname because it's not Jennifer isn't a dead name, and I do very much still use Jennifer in my official documents and all of that. But it's a name that I feel really comfortable with. So everyone in my personal life uses Jay. My family are starting to try it. And generally J is just the one that I feel most comfortable with. But it is really just to stop people from misgendering me or having an idea of my gender in the beginning, because then if I go in with my pronouns are they, them, they don't have the preconceived she, her in their minds, and it's a lot easier for people to slip into they, them straight away, if that makes sense. So yeah.
That's all the questions, I think. Just check.
Oh, there's a hand up from Joe.
Go on then,
Yeah.
Joe.
Hi, sorry, I'd put it in the question box, but it was quite a late one. And Jay knows the angle that I'm coming from on this one. It's something that I'm quite keen that we explore, which is how do we use the knowledge that we have in our LGBTQ plus networks to shape better service experiences for all of our residents in Northamptonshire. So I don't expect Jay or Tracy to suddenly spout forth with a perfect answer, but I think it's a challenge for all of us to think about people within Northamptonshire genuinely getting the best experience they can to deal with all of their health issues in a way that is appropriate to their own situation.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I mean, I can chip in a little bit, and then obviously Tracy, you can chip in and add to what I say. But yeah, no, I think that it is really important. I touched on earlier about using or making sure that we're using sort of gender neutral language in policies, and educating staff and folks in either reverse mentoring or sort of one-to-one trainings. But generally, if I always think that if we share the knowledge as openly as possible within an organization, be that through sort of events like this, or through sort of team trainings or one-to-one trainings or mandatory trainings even, it can mean that the services as a whole are more accepting and diverse, because you've got people with the knowledge and understanding to help folks, so that if service users come in and they are gender non-conforming, or they do have a different sexual orientation, or are an LGBTQ plus identity, in any shape or form, then staff members aren't caught off guard and have the resources and knowledge to deal with whatever requests come up. You know, if somebody, you know, if a cis woman who's a lesbian says, "Oh, you know, my partner's coming in to visit me," you know, having the presumption that her partner is a husband, and acting on that as such, instead of using the language that she's used, for example, and saying, "Oh, your husband could be able to come in," blah blah blah, can immediately, you know, impact how a service user feels in, you know, the receiving of the rest of their care. So if you just mirror somebody's language back to them, and you're aware of how to sort of pick up on that and mirror somebody's language, then it can just be like a really simple, small detail that will make somebody's visit much more pleasant. You know, so people, I mean, especially I'm coming obviously from my healthcare background, and you know, people who are accessing healthcare are already in an uncomfortable position as it is. You know, none of us like going into sort of any healthcare spaces, because it typically means that, you know, we're ill. But if we've at least got a comforting and reassuring environment, and an environment that is openly accepting, and you know, people wearing lanyards that, for example, and you know, it's made very, very obvious that they are going to receive you know, care from either a diverse workforce, and or people who are in the knowledge, or in the know about sort of important things like sexual orientation and gender identity, then it can make a massive difference. I don't know whether Tracy wants to chip in on any more formal stuff.
No, I couldn't agree more. For me, it comes back to what is the environment that you want to create, and then what are the things like education, expectation, even. And absolutely, you know, we're a health service provider. You can't separate staff for culture, staff experience, you know, for patient experience. It all comes together. So it does absolutely come back to some of the things interesting you say, Joe, about the fabric of your policies, of training, of, you know, or etc. etc. But an education, I'm a real believer that if we come at it from an education point of view, then it lands for people a little better than perhaps something they have to tick box to do. But I think it's a number of things for sure. But I couldn't agree more. And that's a very interesting part of any discussion we might want to have. Laura, I can see that you've asked, haven't you, if there are any more questions? I can't see any more.
No, I was just giving people one last chance. If not, we can continue with the presentation.
Yeah.
So back over to you then, Tracy.
Thank you, Laura. And Jay, you might want to have a little look in at the right point, but I cannot tell you what an incredible, brilliant presentation that was. I have about 4 pages of notes down of things that I want to go back and visit. The cash review, I've never read it, etc. So thank you so much. I think it's been, I don't want to speak for others, but some lovely comments in here, but just your own personal journey and the experiences that you've courageously shared. And I loved that conversation at the end about providing space for people to figure, even when they're children in those formative years, but just to figure out, you know, what they might want to be as a human being, because I think you've come at it from a very human place. So incredible presentation, and I'm sure I will speak on behalf of everybody, you know, really grateful to you for coming here and doing that, and support you for your advocacy for this space is exactly what we need, because that's on top of the day job. That's clearly who you are. So really proud to have even been a small part of engaging in this conversation. So thank you so much. And to thank you to Laura, Aaron, who are facilitators, Diana Belfont in the background there, who did a lot of the work. Thank you, because I think it is really important that we keep coming together, connecting, and it is recorded. So Some of you might want to share back in the organisation that people can come and watch this in their own time. So that's a really good thing. And very importantly, there might be people who are affected by what's been talked about here today, and there are some contact numbers there if you need to reach out to people who could give you that support. So thank you for that reminder, Diana. And then please, 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 I know Diana would want me to say this, please feedback. It's how, you know, Diana and the team get to shape the right things. You know, did you find it valuable? You know, what are you going to do with this? But just give us some feedback on how this was for you today. But thank you all for taking the time out to come and attend. Jay, thank you so much for coming in and doing this. I know you've got to run off at some point. Very thought-provoking and thoroughly enjoyable. Very moved by that whole conversation.